Shaq was just out for a casual shopping trip when a rich woman in a sleek Mercedes did the unthinkable. She stole a disabled veteran's parking spot and laughed in his face. The crowd froze, whispers spread, and phones came out. But instead of arguing, Shaq smiled, because he had a plan. What he did next shattered her ego, destroyed her reputation, and made sure she never pulled this stunt again. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. David Matthews, a retired Marine with a prosthetic leg, carefully steered his old pickup truck toward the nearest handicap parking space outside the bustling shopping mall. His blue handicap permit swung slightly from the rearview mirror, reflecting the afternoon sun. He exhaled, relieved to find an open spot close to the entrance. Maneuvering the truck with practiced precision, he prepared to park, when suddenly a sleek black Mercedes swerved in front of him, cutting him off. The tires screeched as the luxury car slid smoothly into the space meant for him. David hit the brakes, gripping the steering wheel as his heart sank. His knuckles turned white, and for a brief moment, he just sat there, trying to process what had just happened. The driver's side door of the Mercedes opened, and out stepped Victoria Hargrove, tall, elegant, draped in designer brands from head to toe. Her heels clicked against the pavement as she tossed her perfectly styled blonde hair over her shoulder. With a smug expression, she adjusted her sunglasses and grabbed her expensive leather purse, acting as if nothing had happened. David rolled down his window, his voice firm but polite. "Ma'am, this is a handicap parking space. I have a permit, and I really need it." Victoria paused, looking at him as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience. Then with a smirk, she chuckled. "Oh, please," she scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "It's just a parking spot. You'll live." David's jaw tightened. He had spent years serving his country, endured the unimaginable, and now he was being disregarded like this? Before he could say another word, a murmur spread through the parking lot. A few shoppers had stopped in their tracks, whispering to one another, their eyes flickering between David and Victoria. Some even pulled out their phones, sensing that something was about to go down. Then from across the lot, a deep, commanding voice sliced through the air like a thunderclap. "Oh, you really messed up." A towering figure stepped forward, casting a long shadow over the pavement. Shaquille O'Neal, arms crossed, eyes locked on Victoria, stood beside his massive black SUV. His expression was unreadable, but the weight of his presence alone sent a ripple of tension through the air. Victoria turned, raising an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "And who the hell are you supposed to be?" she asked with an amused smirk. The crowd gasped. David, however, allowed himself a small, knowing smile. He had a feeling that things were about to take a very interesting turn. Shaq took a step closer, his voice steady but firm. "Lady, you have no idea who you just disrespected." Victoria barely spared Shaq a glance as he stepped closer, towering over her with an imposing presence that made the crowd instinctively step back. His broad shoulders and 6'11" frame cast a shadow over her, but instead of looking intimidated, she let out an exaggerated sigh and rolled her eyes. "Oh, great," she muttered, crossing her arms. "Another wannabe hero." David, still sitting in his truck, shook his head in disbelief. He had recognized Shaquille O'Neal the second he saw him, but it was clear Victoria had no idea who she was dealing with. "Do you even know who that is?" David asked, his voice calm but tinged with amusement. Victoria turned back to Shaq, giving him a once-over, then smirked. "Let me guess," she said, tilting her head. "Some washed-up basketball player trying to stay relevant?" The crowd collectively gasped. A few bystanders murmured in shock, some covering their mouths as they anticipated what was about to happen next. Shaq, however, didn't react the way she expected. He didn't get angry. He didn't even flinch. Instead, a slow smirk spread across his face, his eyes locking onto hers like a predator sizing up its prey. "Lady," he said, his deep voice even and controlled, "you just made this personal." Victoria scoffed. "Oh, please, what are you going to do? Call your basketball buddies to back you up." She let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head as if the whole situation was beneath her. Shaq took another step forward, his towering form now just inches from her. "Nah," he said, voice calm but firm. I don't need backup, but you might want to start looking for some. A nervous flicker passed through Victoria's eyes, but she masked it quickly, straightening her posture. You think you can intimidate me? I have every right to park here. David scoffed. No, you don't. You don't even have a handicap permit. Victoria waved him off dismissively. Details, details. Shaq let out a low chuckle. Details? He turned to the growing crowd. Y'all hearing this? People nodded, some recording with their phones, whispering among themselves. A man in the back muttered, She really doesn't know when to quit. Shaq glanced back at David, his expression unreadable. You served this country, didn't you? David nodded. 20 years, Marine Corps. Shaq's expression hardened. And you lost your leg for it. David tapped his prosthetic. Sure did. Shaq turned back to Victoria, his eyes colder now. So you think it's funny to take a space from a man who gave everything for this country? Victoria's smirk faltered for half a second before she rolled her eyes again. Oh, give me a break. It's just a parking spot. Shaq exhaled sharply, shaking his head. Yeah, all right, he muttered, his smirk returning. Let's see if you're still laughing in a few minutes. Shaq pulled out his phone and started dialing. Victoria's smirk faded. Wait, what are you doing? Victoria folded her arms across her designer coat, lifting her chin defiantly as if she hadn't just insulted a national icon and disrespected a disabled veteran. The smirk on her face deepened, her voice dripping with arrogance as she scoffed. I park where I want. Sue me. A few people in the crowd gasped. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Shaq let out a slow, deep chuckle, tilting his head slightly as he studied her. Oh, we're gonna do better than that, he said, his voice calm but laced with something unreadable, something dangerous. Victoria's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but she quickly recovered, flicking her hair over her shoulder. Please, she scoffed. You think you can scare me? I have money. I have lawyers. What do you have? Some washed-up fame? David, still seated in his truck, let out a dry chuckle. Lady, you really don't know when to quit, do you? By now, the tension in the parking lot had turned electric. More people had stopped to watch, some standing by their cars, others holding up their phones to record. A teenager in the crowd muttered, Oh man, she really just said that to Shaq? Then suddenly the energy shifted. Someone in the crowd called out, Move the car! Move the car! Another voice joined in, louder, Move the car! Within seconds, the chant caught on. Move the car! Move the car! Victoria's eyes widened slightly as she looked around, as if realizing for the first time that she wasn't in control of the situation anymore. She turned back to Shaq. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You can't just turn people against me. Shaq shrugged. Didn't have to. You did that all on your own. Just then, the distant roar of an engine cut through the noise. Victoria's head snapped toward the entrance of the parking lot. A tow truck was pulling in, heading straight for her Mercedes. Victoria's smirk wavered for the first time as Shaq calmly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The parking lot was dead silent, except for the soft murmurs of the crowd and the distant hum of passing cars. With deliberate slowness, Shaq held the phone to his ear. Yeah, he said, his deep voice carrying over the crowd. I need a tow truck. ASAP, Victoria's eyes widened. You wouldn't dare. Shaq turned his head slightly and raised an eyebrow. Wouldn't I? David let out a quiet chuckle from his truck. Oh, he would, he muttered, shaking his head in amusement. The crowd stirred, and a few people started whispering excitedly. No way, is he actually doing this? One man said. She's about to regret every single word, another woman whispered to her friend. Victoria's posture stiffened. You can't tow my car, she snapped, stepping closer to Shaq as if she could physically intimidate him. But standing next to the 7'1" legend, she looked absurdly small. Shaq didn't even blink. You parked in a handicap spot without a permit. You broke the law. He gestured at David's truck. And you stole a space from a disabled veteran. His voice darkened. Yeah, your car's getting towed. Victoria's hands clenched into fists. I'll just pay the fine, she snapped. I have money. Shaq chuckled. That's cute, he said. But this ain't about money, it's about respect. The weight of his words settled over the crowd, and a few people nodded in agreement. Then, just as Victoria opened her mouth to argue again, a distant rumbling sound cut through the air. It was low at first, but within seconds it became unmistakable. The heavy, unmistakable growl of a tow truck engine. A few people in the crowd turned toward the parking lot entrance. "Oh, damn," someone muttered. "It's actually happening." Victoria spun around, her face twisting in horror as she spotted the massive red and white tow truck rolling toward them, its headlights gleaming. Under the afternoon sun, the driver, a burly man in a grease-streaked uniform, pulled the truck to a slow stop a few feet away. He adjusted his sunglasses, glanced at the scene in front of him, then let out a low whistle. "All right," he called out. "Who's the genius parked illegally in a handicap space?" The crowd erupted into laughter. Victoria's face turned red as the driver climbed out, pulling out his towing equipment. She took a step back, panic flickering in her eyes. For the first time, she realized this was actually happening. Victoria's face flushed with a mix of shock and rage as the tow truck driver stepped out, adjusting his cap. He was a burly man, covered in grease stains, his boots clunking heavily against the pavement. He squinted at the scene before him, then let out a low whistle. "All right," he called, voice gruff. "Who's the idiot parked in a handicap spot without a permit?" Laughter rippled through the crowd. People whispered, their phones still recording. Victoria shoved past a few bystanders, her expensive heels clicking against the pavement. "That would be my car," she snapped, tilting her chin up. "And you're not touching it." The driver arched an eyebrow. "Lady, you're parked illegally," he said, walking toward her sleek black Mercedes. "This is textbook towing material." Victoria scoffed, crossing her arms. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Shaq chuckled, stepping beside the driver. "Oh, I'd love to hear this," he said, folding his arms. Victoria shot him a glare before turning back to the driver. "I'm a platinum member at this mall," she said smugly. "I know the manager. If you so much as scratch my car, I'll have your job." The driver smirked, unimpressed. "Lady, I don't work for the mall," he said, swinging open a compartment on the side of his truck. "I work for the city, and the city says your car is coming with me." Victoria's smugness faltered. "This is illegal," she shrieked, stepping in front of her Mercedes. "I'll sue all of you." Shaq let out a deep laugh. "Illegal?" He pointed at the bright blue handicap parking sign painted right in front of her car. "You're parked illegally, lady. You're lucky I didn't call the cops first." Victoria's hands balled into fists. "You're all going to regret this," she hissed. The driver sighed, shaking his head. "Not my problem." He yanked out a heavy-duty tow hook and started attaching it to the front axle of her Mercedes. Victoria's eyes widened in horror as the metal clamped onto her luxury car. She lunged forward, grabbing the tow cable in a panic. "You can't do this!" she screamed. But it was too late. The truck's engine rumbled to life. Victoria's hands trembled as she yanked her phone from her designer purse, her manicured fingers jabbing at the screen. "That's it! I'm calling the cops!" she shrieked, eyes wild with frustration. "You're all going to jail for this." The crowd, now fully invested, erupted into laughter. A man near the front shook his head. "Lady, you parked illegally. What exactly are you going to tell the cops?" Shaq smirked, standing tall with his arms crossed over his chest. "Please do," he said, voice deep and calm. "I'd love to see how this plays out." Victoria shot him a venomous glare, pressing the phone to her ear. "Yes, hello? I'm being harassed at the mall," she said dramatically. "They're stealing my car." The tow truck driver chuckled, securing the final hook on the front of the Mercedes. "Stealing? Lady, I'm doing my job." Victoria turned away from him, pacing in a circle. "Yes, send someone immediately. There's a huge man threatening me." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Oh, so now I'm a huge man, and not just a washed-up basketball player?" Victoria ignored him, her face twisted in rage. "I don't care, just get here fast." She snapped into the phone before hanging up. The parking lot was dead silent for a moment. Then from a distance, the faint sound of sirens cut through the air. The crowd turned their heads toward the street as flashing red and blue lights appeared. Victoria grinned smugly, thinking she'd won. But Shaq? He just shook his head with a chuckle. "Lady," he muttered, "you just played yourself." The police cruiser screeched to a halt, red and blue lights flashing across the parking lot. Victoria smirked triumphantly, flipping her hair over her shoulder as she strutted toward the arriving officers, like they were her personal security team. Finally, she huffed. Arrest that man. He threatened me, and now they're trying to steal my car. She jabbed a perfectly manicured finger toward Shaq, who stood calmly with his arms crossed, watching the scene unfold. The two officers stepped out of their car, adjusting their belts as they surveyed the situation. The first officer, a stocky man with sharp blue eyes, scanned the crowd before his gaze landed on Shaq. His entire expression froze mid-motion. His partner, a younger officer with a buzz cut, followed his gaze. His eyes widened in recognition. Wait, the first officer murmured. Is that Shaquille O'Neal? Shaq tilted his head slightly, offering a small grin. Sup, fellas? The crowd erupted into whispers, their excitement building as the officer's reaction completely shattered Victoria's confidence. Victoria scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. I don't care who he is. He's interfering with my property, and I want him arrested. The second officer, still staring at Shaq, blinked slowly before turning to Victoria. Ma'am, what exactly are you saying he did? Victoria crossed her arms. He's threatening me. He called a tow truck for my car. That's illegal. The older officer glanced toward the illegally parked Mercedes, the active tow truck, and then at Shaq. So, let me get this straight. He pointed at the huge handicap sign right in front of the spot. You parked in a handicap space without a permit? Victoria shifted uncomfortably. I was just running inside for a minute. He had no right to. The officer held up a hand, silencing her. And the man you're trying to have arrested is Shaquille O'Neal? The guy who donates millions to veterans and the disabled? That man? Victoria faltered, her lips twitching as if trying to form a comeback. Then, without warning, both officers burst out laughing. Ma'am, the older cop said between chuckles, you're the problem here. Victoria's face turned scarlet as the realization hit her like a truck. The entire parking lot was now recording, and the officers were not on her side. Victoria's smirk had completely vanished. Her once arrogant expression was now replaced with a look of growing disbelief as the officers continued chuckling at her demands. The authority she had assumed she held over the situation was slipping through her fingers like sand, and she could feel it. Frustration twisted her features as she stomped her foot against the pavement, her voice rising in an indignant shriek. This isn't funny. You should be arresting him, she snapped, her manicured finger jabbing toward Shaq. He's the one trying to have my car towed. I'll have all of you fired for this. One of the officers, an older man with graying hair and a badge that read Sergeant Lopez, let out a deep, weary sigh. He had dealt with plenty of entitled people in his career, and this woman was no different. Pulling out his notepad, he met her gaze with unimpressed indifference before asking a single question. All right, ma'am, let's get this straight. Do you have a handicap parking permit? The question landed like a slap across the face. Victoria's confidence faltered. She blinked rapidly, her mouth opening and closing, as if searching for a response that wouldn't make things worse. Around her, the parking lot had gone eerily silent. The onlookers, some still recording, leaned in closer, eager to witness what would happen next. Excuse me, she finally scoffed, her voice losing some of its edge. Lopez tapped his pen against his notepad. It's a simple question, ma'am. Do you or do you not have a handicap permit? Victoria's hands clenched around the straps of her designer purse. A nervous chuckle escaped her lips, though it carried none of the arrogance she had displayed earlier. Well, I was only in the store for a second, she muttered, shifting uncomfortably. Does it really matter? The second officer, a younger man with sharp eyes, crossed his arms. Yeah, it matters. A lot, actually. With a slow, deliberate motion, Lopez flipped open his ticket book. Ma'am, you are illegally parked in a designated handicap space without a permit, he stated flatly. That carries a pretty hefty fine. Victoria's eyes widened in horror as Lopez clicked his pen and began writing. You can't be serious, she sputtered, her face turning red. Oh, I'm very serious, Lopez replied, barely sparing her a glance as he continued scribbling on the ticket. Let's see. Illegal parking, misuse of a handicap space, interfering with a lawful tow. Each word landed like a hammer blow, and Victoria's panic escalated. Around her, the murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their amusement evident. Several people had their phones up, still recording, their smirks mirroring Shaq's. Victoria turned to him, eyes burning with fury. "You think this is funny, don't you?" Shaq, who had been silently watching with his arms folded across his massive chest, finally let out a chuckle. "A little bit." She whirled on him, her voice nearly shrieking. "Do you even know who I am?" Shaq tilted his head slightly, considering her words before answering with a slow, deliberate smirk. "Nah, but you're about to find out who I am." Before Victoria could fire back, Lopez ripped the ticket from his book and slapped it against her windshield. The crisp sound echoed in the air, followed immediately by her sharp gasp of outrage. Her entire body stiffened, as if she had just been physically struck. Her eyes darted between the ticket, the officers, and the growing audience, and for the first time since this all began, she realized she was completely out of options. She balled her fists at her sides, her face flushed with fury. "You can't do this!" Shaq's smirk widened, his voice dropping into a low, amused rumble. "Oh, we're just getting started." Victoria stood frozen, her breath coming in short, angry gasps as the tow truck driver secured the final strap around her luxury Mercedes. The sound of metal clanking against metal sent a chill down her spine. Her once smug demeanor had completely crumbled, replaced with sheer panic as she watched her car, her status symbol, being prepped for removal. "You can't do this! That car is worth more than your entire salary!" she shrieked at the tow truck driver, who merely rolled his eyes and continued his work. Shaq, still towering beside David, pulled out his phone with deliberate ease, his large fingers tapping the screen as he placed a call. His expression was unreadable, but the slight smirk tugging at the corner of his lips suggested he was far from finished. Victoria, now frantic, turned toward him. Who are you calling now?" Shaq met her glare with calm amusement. "Mall management." The color drained from her face. The call barely rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. "Mr. O'Neill?" Shaq didn't waste a second. "Yeah, I'm standing outside your main entrance watching some lady park in a handicap space, verbally harass a disabled veteran, and throw a tantrum because she got caught. You cool with that kind of customer in your mall?" A brief silence. Then the voice on the other end sighed heavily. "Absolutely not. What's her name?" Shaq turned to Victoria, raising an eyebrow. "You want to tell him, or should I?" Victoria's jaw tightened. "You wouldn't dare." Shaq chuckled, then spoke into the phone. "She ain't cooperating, but she's standing next to a towed black Mercedes screaming her head off. Shouldn't be too hard to figure out." The manager exhaled sharply. "I'll handle it. She's banned from the premises, effective immediately." Victoria's eyes widened in horror. "What? You can't ban me. Do you have any idea how much money I spend here?" "Not anymore, you don't," Shaq said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. As if on cue, the tow truck's engine rumbled to life, the hydraulic lift raising her Mercedes into the air. Victoria let out a furious wail, lunging forward as if she could stop it with sheer willpower. The driver turned to her, barely suppressing a grin. "Lady, unless you want to be towed with it, I suggest you step back." The crowd burst into laughter, their phones capturing every moment as Victoria stood there seething. David, watching the entire scene unfold, slowly turned toward Shaq, shaking his head in disbelief. "You really are something else." Shaq grinned, cracking his knuckles. "And we ain't done yet." David let out a tired sigh, rubbing his temples as he watched Victoria's Mercedes disappear down the road, attached to the tow truck like a fallen empire. The chaos had finally settled, and yet, standing there in the parking lot, he felt oddly stuck. His old truck had broken down earlier that week, which was why he had barely managed to make it here in a borrowed car. Now that ride was long gone. Shaq, noticing David's shift in demeanor, turned to him. "You good, sir?" David chuckled dryly, shaking his head. "Well, I was, but looks like I'm stuck here unless I want to walk home." He gestured to his bad leg. "And that's not really an option." Shaq tilted his head, considering something. Then without a word, he pulled out his phone again and tapped the screen a few times. David furrowed his brow. "What are you doing?" Shaq didn't answer. He just smirked. Minutes later, the faint sound of an engine rumbled in the distance. A sleek, black pickup truck rolled into the lot, shining under the afternoon sun. It wasn't just any truck. It was brand new, spotless, and built like a beast. The driver pulled up in front of them, stepped out, and handed Shaq a set of keys. David blinked. "Wait, what's this?" Shaq dangled the keys in front of him. "Your new ride." David's jaw dropped. "What?" Shaq clapped a massive hand on his shoulder. "I don't do half measures, my guy. You serve this country, and you shouldn't have to struggle for basic things. So this is yours now." David's hands trembled as he reached for the keys, his eyes welling up. I, I can't accept this, man. This is too much." Shaq shook his head. "Nah, what was too much was watching that lady treat you like dirt. This question mark. This is just me making sure you get treated like the hero you are." David looked at the truck, then back at Shaq. His voice cracked. "I don't know what to say." Shaq grinned. "Say you'll take it for a spin." David turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and so did the crowd's cheers. David stood frozen, the keys resting in his palm like they weighed 100 pounds. His breath hitched as he slowly looked up at the gleaming, brand-new pickup. Truck parked just a few feet away. The deep metallic blue paint reflected the afternoon sun, and the polished chrome accents sparkled. This wasn't just a truck. It was the kind of vehicle he had dreamed about owning, but never imagined would actually be his. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "Wait, what's this?" Shaq grinned, crossing his arms as he nodded toward the truck. "It's yours, man." David swallowed hard, his mind racing. I can't accept this. It's too much." His fingers clenched around the keys, like he was afraid they might vanish if he let go. Shaq shook his head. "Nah, you earned this. You served your country, put your body on the line, and what do you get? People like her treating you like you don't matter." His jaw tightened as he motioned toward the empty spot where Victoria's towed Mercedes had been. "That don't sit right with me." David chuckled shakily, trying to blink away the sudden mist in his eyes. "Man, I don't know what to say." Shaq's massive hand clapped onto David's shoulder, grounding him. "Then don't say anything. Just take the damn truck." The small crowd that had gathered erupted into cheers, people clapping and pulling out their phones to capture the moment. Someone shouted, "Shaq, you're a legend." Another voice added, "This man deserves it." David exhaled deeply, still staring at the truck, trying to process everything. The scent of fresh leather and new paint lingered in the air as he took a hesitant step forward. His old truck, now little more than a rusted-out memory, had died on him just last week, and he'd been worried sick about how he'd get to his VA appointments. Now, he had a brand-new, fully loaded pickup. His fingers traced the bold emblem on the tailgate, his heart pounding. He turned back to Shaq, shaking his head in disbelief. This can't be real." Shaq's smirk widened. "Too late, big man. Title's already in your name." David's knees almost buckled as the truth hit him. His new beginning was just getting started. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Within hours, Victoria's public meltdown had spread like wildfire across the internet. Clips of her screeching at the tow truck driver, demanding the police arrest Shaq, and ultimately crumbling under humiliation flooded social media. The hashtags #1 parking spot Karen, #1 Shaq justice, and #1 karma hits hard trended at #1. News outlets picked up the footage, dissecting every second. "Entitled woman steals veteran spot, regrets it instantly," read one viral headline. Another article labeled her the most hated woman in America this week. Victoria, once the polished and powerful CEO of a high-end real estate firm, was suddenly radioactive. Her inbox flooded, not with business inquiries but with angry emails, dropped contracts, and severed partnerships. Inside her luxury penthouse, she sat frozen at her desk, phone vibrating endlessly. A call from her assistant flashed across the screen. "Victoria, we have a problem." The assistant's voice wavered. "The board just had an emergency meeting. They've decided to. I swear, if you say fire me, they're cutting ties." The words sliced through like a dagger. "Your name is toxic. Investors are pulling out. They don't want you representing the company anymore." Victoria's stomach twisted. This is a joke, right? It's on every major news site, her assistant whispered. You're done. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of a family-owned diner, Shaq leaned back in his booth, scrolling through the chaos on his phone. The video had racked up over 20 million views, and the comments were ruthless. I have second-hand embarrassment for this woman. Stealing a veteran's spot and mocking him? She deserves every bit of this. Shaq is the hero we don't deserve. Across the table, David sipped his coffee, shaking his head in disbelief. Man, I still can't wrap my head around this. 1 minute I'm being pushed around, the next, you hand me a brand new truck, and she's losing everything. Shaq smirked, setting his phone down. That's how karma works, big man, David chuckled. Yeah? Well, I sure wouldn't want to be her right now. As Victoria disappeared from the public eye, drowning in scandal, David drove off in his brand new truck, his future finally looking bright.